Hello and welcome to the Reviews Brothers. We are back looking at the A to Z of PlayStation 1 Hidden Gems, and we've made it to the letter T. This was another tricky letter with plenty of games that I could have included, but as always I have whittled it down to just 10 that I hadn't really heard of and that certainly don't get as much coverage as they deserve. Well, some of them anyway. Now, as always, how about I shut my noise, you press that subscribe button, and we take a look at some games.
He infects the system with a specially designed predator virus.
First up is Tigershark, a really cool but hard as nails 3D action game where you are the titular Tigershark, an aquatic boat submarine hybrid thing that is armed to the teeth with rockets, machine guns, EMPs, and even more rockets. The story goes that the Russians are being naughty, you don't say, and they have a load of underwater bases, power plants, ships and subs of their own, and they're using them to get up to no good. So you got to go blow them up, which is much easier said than done, but it's still fun nonetheless. Each of the quite numerous levels sees you exploring above and below the surface of the water, taking down outposts or using your EMPs to knock out certain ones that you're not allowed to destroy. Thankfully, controlling your ship is actually really good. It's fast, responsive and pretty nimble. And thank God, as there are a ton of enemies all over the place, and they'll be on you like flies on things that aren't pleasant. Even the early on levels are very tricky with the number of enemies coupled with the PS1 era draw distance, meaning that you can't always see what's coming up, or sometimes even when you do see the enemies they'll end up vanishing as they get further away from you, only to suddenly appear in front of you blasting homing rockets at you. Thankfully your weapons are decent. You get an unlimited supply of a laser gun which does well enough against most enemies, but for the bigger ships and enemy bases you'll want to use your missiles, which you do have a limited supply on, but you can find more throughout the levels, so don't worry too much. Aiming these against anything that's moving is pretty hard though, as they take a while to travel and enemy patterns are unpredictable, but stick with your laser and you'll generally be fine. Unfortunately, the missions here are all pretty much the same, with only a few things being added in, like having to make sure certain things don't get blown up, but for the most part you're doing the same objectives on every level, but the layouts are quite different, with more mountains and obstacles being in the way, or even with the water being frozen on the surface, making it hard, or sometimes impossible, to find a way to the land bases. The graphics are decent enough, but you can only see a few feet ahead of you, which is a shame, and the sound and music are as generic as they come. But that doesn't mean it's a bad game, in fact it's pretty damn fun. It will kick your ass a lot, and I had to resort to cheats on some of the higher levels, though with more practice I know I could do it. Worth a look if you like this sort of thing. Fighting time now with a game that I'm going to butcher the name of, which is Toki Denshu Angel Eyes. This is another one of those Japanese-only fighting games with an all-female roster, and who knew I'd be playing so many of them when I started making this series. Not sure if that's a reflection on the PS1 or on me. Oh well. So yeah, it's a fighting game, and it has a story, but I've really got no idea what it's going on about, but it seems to be about a bunch of schoolgirls, businesswomen and androids that all want to have a scrap, and thankfully most of them have massive bouncy boobs, so that makes it all okay. You get a pretty decent roster here, and there's even quite a few unlockable characters to get, which is always nice. You can take part in an arcade mode or a story mode, the only difference being that at the end of arcade mode you unlock artwork, whereas with the story mode you get a cutscene between each fight, and that's where you unlock the new characters. All the characters are actually pretty decent. The game uses the Street Fighter control method, which is the best one if you ask me, with light, medium and strong attacks, as well as special moves that can be done with quarter circle motions or holding back for a few seconds, that sort of thing. The moves are pretty easy to pull off and the controls are responsive. What's strange though is the fact that the game has a few different art styles in it. You've got your standard hand-drawn sprites, which look decent with some great, bouncy animations. Each one looks unique and an overall good anime style. Then some of the characters, which as far as I can tell are either always robots or angels, are pre-rendered and look like they should be in a totally different game. This is a very strange choice, and these characters don't animate that well, but thankfully they do control the same and still have decent hit detection. It just looks more like a Mugen thing where they've been mashed together from different games. Now, I'm sure if I could understand the story, there's probably a reason for it. The fighting here is good though, and it's easy to pull off combos and most of the special moves, though I did find some super specials were hard to do. It's also not easy, with bosses putting up a hell of a fight, often feeling quite unfair actually, but stick with it and you'll beat the bitch. This doesn't really do anything too drastic that you haven't seen before, but it's still a solid fighting game that I really enjoy playing, and you know what? You might too. Concerto is a really cool action game starring a bunch of furries where, like in reality, dogs are the good guys and cats are evil things that pretend to be your friend but actually want you dead for no real reason. Or in the case of the game here, they steal stuff and generally cause mischief. You play as Waffle, a poochy policeman who has the task of tracking down these evil cats and bringing them to justice after they steal some jewels and of course a princess for good measure. As most police dogs do, you have a massive mech suit that you can wander around in and do your policing with. This comes in very handy as it lets you jump high into the air, pick up and smash large objects, climb stuff and of course shoot bubbles. The main thing is that it can magically store and arrest these pesky pussies after you've given them a bit of a beating. As you explore the game's pretty large world, which is made up of various islands, you'll meet a load of cats hidden all over the place and you'll need to use your mech powers to throw things at them to stun them, or shoot them with your bubbles to capture them, or you can just bitch slap them. Once you've stunned them, you can grab them and shove them in your mech, which presumably arrests them. It's actually really satisfying, and the combat and movement here is great. The game is semi-open world too. As you play, you'll unlock new islands and areas and meet new people who will give you various missions that you can carry out for them. Usually it's finding an item or getting rid of cats in the area, or other action-adventure RPG things. Of course, you'll be rewarded with items and power-ups for your troubles, which will help you out no end. Graphically, the game is fantastic, with some really great, bright, colourful levels and characters, and the animation is very smooth and very impressive. Each one of the islands and environments is unique, and the enemy designs are cool too, with loads of cats and mechs and flying machines to take on. In fact, some of them get pretty damn tough when you might not expect them to, especially as it's such a cute looking game. The cutscenes are also really good. They're a mix of in-game graphics as well as some animated cutscenes that look just like an anime, with needlessly sexy animals arguing about who gets to take the princess. It's all very exciting. It's a pretty big adventure too. I've put about 8 or 9 hours into it so far, and I don't think I'm actually that far near the end. But it's a lot of fun, and I can't believe I'd never heard of it before. The graphics and controls are so solid, and it's just a fun game to play. This is probably one that's quite popular, but maybe it just went by me. Definitely give this one a go, if you haven't already. Time for a different tale now, with Tale of the Sun, though it's still spelled as an animal's tale for some reason. Anyway, this is a very unique game where you play as a caveman or woman, or should I say cave person, and you're basically immediately left to do whatever the hell you want in a pretty large open world. You can explore everywhere, and you'll find plants and animals all over the place. You want to pick up the plants and eat them. They give you strength, but each plant does a different thing, so some will make you faster, some stronger, and so on. You can sort of tell which one is which when you eat it, as your body will flash in the area that it's affecting you, so if your arms glow, you know you've gotten stronger. You'll need to fight the wildlife too. Doing this gives you meat to eat, which replenishes your health and again helps you get stronger. Eventually you'll fight mammoths, though it's not easy to get to this point, and when you do, they drop their tusks, which you can take back to your base to make a tower. Make a tower big enough and you beat the game. It is a really simple game, and it's actually one that you can beat in about an hour when you know what you're doing, but it's never really the same every time you play it. Some of the locations and things are in the same place, and you'll find power-ups and rock formations that contain other items to use, but finding the animals and other things like that isn't always the same. It's kind of hard to put this game into a category too. It's basically a 3D action adventure with light RPG elements, but it knows what it is, and it's not particularly complicated, and it's one of those games that's meant to be played in short bursts. Controlling your cave person is easy enough, and you can basically just run, jump and punch. This works well enough, and the hit detection though is very hit and miss, and a lot of the enemies are incredibly hard to fight. The graphics are pretty simplistic and actually kind of ugly, the enemies in particular having little to no detail on them, which is a real shame, though it does mean the game is always running at a good speed. One mechanic that is a little annoying is that you need to sleep, which I guess does make sense, though you don't have a sleep meter or stamina bar or anything like that. Instead, when it's time to sleep, your character does just fall asleep there and then, even if you're in the middle of fighting a bear, and they don't give a crap. And that's really all there is to the game. You just run around, powering yourself up and hunting for animals. I guess it's pretty accurate to how cavemen probably would have been. It's one of those games that doesn't really have a major goal. Instead, you're just meant to play it casually and throw it on here and there for a quick blast. I do enjoy playing this one, but I can tell it's a game that a lot of people probably won't like. Though, if you are like me and enjoy games that are quirky and try something new, then this is well worth checking out. Tenhi Jack is a Japan-only game that is basically the story of Jack and the Beanstalk with a crazy Japanese twist. You are Jack, a gross blue boy who is kicked out of his house when his mum realises he's sold their shit for some magic beans. So your mission is to climb the beanstalk that has sprouted to get the goods and save your family from starving. It's a 2.5D platform game that is wacky and a lot harder than you'd think. Your goal is to basically climb the beanstalk, which is done in stages. Along the way, there's loads of enemies and obstacles you'll need to deal with. Like anyone called Jack, you can throw your head as a weapon. This will stun enemies because if someone throws their head at you, you're going to be stunned. Then you can pick them up and throw them into other enemies or obstacles on the level to kill or break them. Do this enough and the portal at the end of the stage will open up and you'll move on to the next one. There's two main places you can travel here, on the outside vines, which are basically your paths, or you can jump on the actual beanstalk itself. But here you need to be careful as you lose stamina when climbing, and if you run out, you'll fall. You can control yourself when you're falling, so you won't want to fall too far, but sometimes you will miss a platform and have to go back and miss loads of progress. This is kind of annoying. Also, enemies all respawn, but they're not particularly tough, so it's not the end of the world. The graphics here are pretty cool, with a nice cartoony style to everything, and it just has a very impressive draw distance, with you being able to see pretty much all the way to the top of the beanstalk. Something that you wouldn't really expect, and I didn't see any pop-in or slowdown. And the music here has to get a mention as it's just awesome, with a track that just has someone saying "Let's go Jack" over and over again, and it somehow never gets old. Well, actually it did for a minute or so, but then somehow I just loved it again. And that's all there is to this one really. It's a pretty simple platform game, but it's a lot of fun. It is worth looking up how to play it beforehand if you're going to, as everything is in Japanese and there's no translation that I could find, and it was a little confusing to start with. But once you get used to it, it's a pretty good time. Now, I'm going to butcher the name of this game here, and it's something like Tenhi Wo Kurao. It's another Japanese exclusive, this time from Capcom, and it's based on a manga series that those strategy games about romancing a kingdom on the NES are. Thankfully, this isn't one of those boring strategy games though. Instead, it's a classic Capcom beat-em-up, like Final Fight, though it's not as good, or as classic. You choose from one of 5 characters here, each with the usual stats and speeds, and then you set out across what I'm assuming is China, chopping people up. It starts off great with you riding a horse with a massive blade on a stick. You'll be killing people left, right and centre with your one attack button, but this is Capcom, so it's just so satisfying to do it. You'll eventually lose your horse and the game goes to a more traditional beat 'em up with the usual gameplay here. It doesn't really do anything new other than having a few different attacks you can do, kinda like Street Fighter, but these moves aren't actually that handy and I found they were more hassle than they were worth to use most of the time. Each level ends in a massive boss fight, and these guys are really tough. They have a massive life bar and shockingly will beat you in just a handful of attacks. Your best bet is to do the old hit and run tactic. The regular enemies don't put up too much of a fight and are only really a problem thanks to the sheer number of them that you have to fight. What's funny is that you can really see they reused assets from other games here, as I'm sure I recognise a lot of the enemies from Final Fight and even Captain Commando. I wonder if they're just descendants and this is actually set in the same universe, just in the past. Or I could be wrong and maybe this game came out before those ones. The levels here aren't too long and they're kinda samey, with you going through forests and towns and not really anything else. And the game is kind of easy. You do get a handful of continues and thankfully you can also change character between continues, so you can try them all out in one playthrough. But the game only lasts about an hour and then you will have beaten it. Though that's normal for this type of game and is actually usually welcome as they can get quite repetitive if they go on for too much longer. And there's not much more to say about it, to be honest. It is your standard beat 'em up game, but it's a solid one. If you like games like this, then the chances are you're going to have a good time with it. The graphics are decent, and it is cool to have so many characters to choose from. Give it a go if you think it looks fun. Tatsunoku Fight is another Japan-only fighting game starring a bunch of superhero characters from the popular Japanese Tatsunoku franchises that I'm afraid I have no idea about, but they look really cool. You get a good selection of characters to choose from here, with plenty being unlocked as you play. This is another one with a Street Fighter style control setup with the same motions being used for special attacks, and it works very well. The fighting action here is solid and the special moves are really cool. You've got a few game modes here. Most notable are the arcade and story modes, which are basically exactly what you'd expect. Arcade are just a series of fights, and story mode throw in some walls of text for people that can speak Japanese. The story mode does have fewer characters to choose from, and is actually quite short, but that's alright, it's only a fighting game after all. You do get loads of what I'm assuming are clips from the show, which is cool, and the music to those is equal parts amazing and terrible. The graphics are great with hand-drawn sprites. The animation is good, but I was hoping for a bit better animation. Some of it feels a bit cheap and 16-bit, but overall it's decent. Most importantly though are the controls, which are very good and responsive, and the hit detection is very good. And really that's all I need to say about this one. It is your standard fighting game of this sort, though the characters are really cool and have some great entrances, and the battles themselves are a lot of fun. This is another one to try for fighting game fans. Terracon is a really cool, unique game that I'd never heard of, but some of my awesome viewers were kind enough to recommend it for me, so I gave it a go. It's a third-person action game where you play as an alien, which is always a good thing if you ask me. You're from the planet Pluto, and are part of a team of people, or aliens, who terraform planets to make them inhabitable. Sadly, your computer thingy, the Terracon, becomes self-aware and decides that you all need to die and shuts down the operation. You and a few others survive and carry on doing what you do, all the while getting powerful enough to stop the evil computer. This is a pretty massive game with dozens of levels, though they're all fairly short once you know what you're doing, but it doesn't mean they're easy. You'll need to explore each level looking for a red energy to power up your weapons, as well as launch codes for that planet's defense system, so you can fire missiles at the evil Terracon spaceship and blow it to bits. The levels all have enemies that are out to stop you though, and you'll often need to battle them to get health, ammo, and of course some bigger bosses that are keeping hold of launch codes you need. You do get a few objectives on each level too, ranging from building bases to finding dropships and defeating the enemies that are on the levels, and building structures and bases is actually a big part of gameplay. To do this, it's pretty simple. You can always see the outline of where buildings should be, and you need Genergy, which is actually what the red stuff is called, in order to shoot at the outline. This makes the building appear. These buildings don't actually do too much, though sometimes they will create shields or something that you can use as cover. Most of the time though, they're just part of your colonising effort, and they'll be needed once you've gotten rid of that Terracon bastard. You'll also use the Genergy to defeat enemies, and the game has a really good lock-on mechanic when fighting enemies that makes it easy to outrun them while attacking. It's really well implemented and makes the combat intuitive and fun. There's also times where the enemies will destroy parts of the levels, mainly things like bridges etc, so you need to go and repair these. It's never that complicated, but you'll need to find the Genergy and have enough to do it. Some levels also have vehicles that you can get around in, and of course they give you more firepower and health. These are fun to ride in. Controlling everything is very smooth and responsive, and the game actually feels quite far ahead of its time in terms of how it plays, and the graphics here are also really good. The cutscenes have some incredible animation using the in-game engine, and the characters and humour are all really good. Your character, Zed, is very likeable and just a cool guy. What's also impressive here is the draw distance. You can see miles into the distance, and the game always runs at a decent frame rate, though it does have a bit of slowdown when the action gets too manic. Which it often does, as you get loads of enemies that come in the form of insect things or robots or combinations of the two. It's always fun to see what each level has in store, and all the planets you explore are all different and unique. The game really is the definition of the hidden gem. It's one of the best looking games on the system, I'd say, and the gameplay is just as good as the graphics. It's not easy, but it is really fun and will definitely keep you entertained all the way through. This is definitely a must-have for PS1 owners, but for some reason it was never released in North America, so you'll have to play this any way you can. Time Boken series, Boken Desoyo, is a Japan exclusive shooter based on an anime that, yes, I have no idea about. You can choose from a ton of characters here, or should I say a ton of strange craft to drive around in this vertical shooter. I've got no idea what the story is, as it's all very Japanese, but it actually looks like you play as the bad guys here and are trying to stop the good guys, who also kinda look bad. Though, don't quote me on that. So you choose from your craft and then set out on some pretty large wacky levels, shooting the hell out of everything that moves, and some things that don't. If you've played a shooter before, you know what to expect. And I'm going to assume you have, so you know what's up. You move up the screen holding the shoot button. If it flashes when you shoot it, then it can be destroyed, and you want to blow up as much as you can, and the enemies and scenery will drop power-ups that make your weapon stronger, replenish your health, and of course give you access to some massive screen clearing attacks, all of which vary for each of the ships. And it's all so much fun to do so, thanks to the silly tone of the game, and I'm guessing the series. It's all crazy with the bizarre characters and bosses that are great fun to battle, and you'll need to learn their patterns if you want to get anywhere here. Thankfully, it's not too hard to do. Characters also have a lot to say here, popping up and shouting stuff that I don't understand, but I'm sure it's hilarious and informative. The graphics here are excellent, with some really great 2D sprites. The weapons are all awesome, and I really like the design of the enemies here. There's loads of animated cutscenes too, which I'm guessing are right out of the series. The controls are solid and responsive, though I wasn't really sure how to use my specials properly. There seem to be a few different ones that you can do, but I couldn't figure out how to change which one I did. Sometimes I'd change into a giant mech, and sometimes I'd just throw a boring bomb, even with the same ship. I'm sure it's a simple thing, and it's something that's somewhere that tells me how to do it, but I probably just couldn't understand it. Even so, I had a blast playing this game. It was loads of fun, and definitely one I recommend. And finally for today, here is Time Commando. Probably a game that'd be classed as a bit of a guilty pleasure for me rather than a hidden gem, but yeah, I genuinely really like it. You are a time commando, and some evil bastards have been messing around with time and sent you back to the past, so you've got to fight your way through time, making your way back, using the convenient time chips and teleporters that have also been left around the various time periods. It's a 3D action game with FMV elements. You've got a fixed camera angle, but you and all the enemies are 3D models that can move around the world however you want. But the camera moves kind of like those old FMV games, and once it's moved, which happens when you trigger it at certain points, you can't go back at all. Most of the time this isn't a problem, however there are times where you'll see items that you want to get to, but if you walk to the wrong spot, the camera will move and you'll miss them with no way to make it back. But anyway, each level is a case of you wandering around, fighting enemies, collecting time chips, and just making it to the end without dying. If you do, it's back to the start of the level. You'll be visiting prehistoric lands filled with cavemen and bears, the Roman Empire, ancient Spain, a galleon, and you eventually make it to modern times and even the future, where you can right the wrongs that the evil bastards that sent you back there have done. The combat here is sort of typical for the era of games like this, especially ones that also appeared on the PC like this one did. This means that you are holding down the attack button, and then each direction you press on the pad is a different attack. Now, I don't know if it's because I grew up with Alone in the Dark, but I really don't mind this, and I actually think it works quite well. You've got weak and strong attacks, and the more powerful the attack, the slower it is. The weaker attacks are fast but have a shorter range. You'll also find a ton of weapons in the game, with each time period having its own unique weapons and enemies. So you get clubs, spears, swords, guns, knives, and all sorts. It's great. And each weapon has their own strengths and weaknesses, and thankfully you can carry loads of them and swap between them however often you like. It's really cool seeing all the new time periods, weapons and enemies. And all the levels are nice and varied. Each of them do have a time limit, as the game is all about time, and if it runs out, the portal will close, so you'll be stuck there for good. But if you find the time chips, you can drop them off at various points in the level to increase your time. To be fair though, I never actually had a problem with the time limit. As well as this, you can collect health, which are yellow cubes like the ones doctors hand out these days. It can take a while to get used to the controls and how the game works, but once you do, I think it's a load of fun to play. The graphics have a certain charm to them. The FMV does look kinda bad, but I do like it, and the way the camera swings around. The character models are also kinda bad, and the animation is just laughable most of the time, but again, for some reason, it kind of has a charm. It is quite a tough game while you get used to it, but the whole thing can be beaten in under 3 hours when you know what you're doing, and I really would recommend giving this a try. I think it's a great campy game that has the same appeal to me as a crappy B-movie does. Check it out if you can. So there you go, 10 more hidden gems for the PS1, this time starting with the letter T. Which one was your favourite, and of course which one of the many others could I have included? Be sure to let us know in the comments below. Now all that's left for me to say is thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.